In 1845, two ships set sail from England, venturing into this unforgiving wilderness. Their mission: to chart the last unexplored sections of the Northwest Passage, a fabled sea route that promised to link Europe with Asia. Their fate: to vanish into the icy silence, leaving behind a tale of horror, mystery, and the limits of human endurance. This is the story of the Franklin expedition.
It's a mystery.
Our story begins in Victorian England, an era defined by rapid technological advancement and a fervent belief in the power of human ingenuity to conquer nature. It was a time when the British Empire stretched across the globe and the spirit of exploration burned bright in the national consciousness. For centuries, the Arctic had captured the imagination of explorers. Men like Martin Frobisher, Henry Hudson, and William Edward Parry had all tried to unlock the secrets of the Northwest Passage. Many had failed. Some had died. But in 1845, the British Admiralty believed they had the key to success. Enter Sir John Franklin, a 59-year-old Royal Navy officer with a distinguished, if somewhat checkered, career. Franklin had led two previous Arctic expeditions, earning him the nickname the Man Who Ate His Boots, after being forced to consume shoe leather to survive on one particularly disastrous journey. Despite his age and lack of recent sea experience, Franklin was chosen to lead what many believed would be the definitive Arctic expedition. The goal was clear: navigate the last uncharted sections of the Northwest Passage, a sea route through the Arctic that would connect the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. If successful, it would revolutionize global trade, shortening the journey between Europe and Asia by thousands of miles. For this monumental task, Franklin was given two ships, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror. These weren't ordinary vessels. They were the cutting edge of 1840s technology, specially outfitted for Arctic exploration. The ships boasted reinforced hulls to withstand ice pressure, retractable screw propellers, and steam engines. They were heated by a system of pipes that distributed warm air throughout the vessels, a novel feature for the time. The Admiralty spared no expense in equipping these floating fortresses against the Arctic's assault. The provisions were equally impressive. The ships carried enough supplies to last 3 years, including over 32,000 pounds of preserved meat, 1,000 gallons of liquor, and a 1,200-volume library. They even brought daguerreotype equipment to document their historic journey. Among the provisions were thousands of cans of preserved food, a relatively new technology at the time. These cans, soldered shut with lead, would later play a sinister role in the expedition's fate. With a combined crew of 129 men, carefully selected from thousands of volunteers, the Franklin expedition seemed poised for success. The officers were experienced, the men were hardy, and the ships were state-of-the-art. Little did they know that they were sailing into oblivion. On May 19, 1845, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror departed England amidst great fanfare. Crowds cheered from the shore, confident they were witnessing the start of a triumphant voyage. The ships made brief stops in Greenland to pick up supplies and send their last letters home. They were last seen by European whalers in Baffin Bay in July of that same year. The captain of the whaler reported that all seemed well with the expedition. The men were in good spirits, eager to begin their push into the unknown reaches of the Arctic. After that, silence. As months turned into years with no word from Franklin, anxiety grew in England. In an age before radio communication, long silences from polar expeditions were not uncommon. But as the months stretched into years, hope began to fade. It wasn't until 1848, 3 years after Franklin's departure, that the Admiralty launched its first search parties. Over the next decade, dozens of expeditions would scour the Arctic, searching for any trace of Franklin and his men. The search for Franklin became one of the largest rescue operations in history. It captured the public imagination and led to the mapping of much of the Arctic coastline. Ironically, more was discovered looking for Franklin than Franklin ever discovered himself. The mystery captivated the Victorian public. Newspapers ran regular updates on search efforts. Public meetings were held to discuss theories about the expedition's fate. Franklin's wife, Lady Jane Franklin, became a driving force behind the search efforts, using her connections and personal fortune to fund expeditions. But while the British public clamored for news, the Inuit people of the Arctic had already encountered traces of the doomed expedition. Their oral histories, largely ignored by early searchers, would later prove crucial in unraveling the mystery. It wasn't until 1850, 5 years after Franklin's departure, that the first solid clues emerged. On Beechy Island, searchers made a grim discovery: 3 graves of Franklin's men who had died in the first winter: John Torrington, John Hartnell, and William Brain. These names, etched in stone, were silent testaments to the expedition's early struggles, but they offered no hint of the horrors that were to follow. Through bits of evidence and Inuit testimony, a fragmentary timeline of the expedition's fate began to emerge. By September 1846, just a year into their journey, disaster struck. Both ships became hopelessly trapped in ice off King William Island. For 19 months, the crews remained aboard their frozen prisons. The ships drifted with the ice, carried by currents in a slow, grinding dance. During this time, on June 11, 1847, Sir John Franklin died. His death marked the beginning of the expedition's spiral into tragedy. The most crucial piece of evidence came in the form of a note discovered years later at Victory Point on King William Island. This chilling document, dated April 25, 1848, revealed the crew's desperate situation. Sir John Franklin died on the 11th of June, 1847, and the total loss by deaths in the expedition has been to this date 9 officers and 15 men. The note went on to state that the survivors, now led by Francis Crozier and James Fitzjames, were abandoning the ships and attempting to trek south to safety. 105 men set out across the frozen landscape, dragging heavy lifeboats filled with supplies. They were hoping to reach Back's Fish River on the Canadian mainland, where they might find help. None of them would ever be seen alive by European eyes again. The distance they needed to cover was over 1,000 miles. In their weakened state, across unforgiving terrain, it was a journey that bordered on the impossible. The Arctic summer, with its endless daylight, would have added to their disorientation and suffering. The Inuit people of the region provided some of the most haunting accounts of the expedition's final days. They spoke of encounters with strange, gaunt figures wandering the ice. These men were described as walking dead, with hollow eyes and skin blue with cold. They stumbled as if in a dream, speaking words the Inuit could not understand. These eyewitness accounts paint a picture of men pushed beyond the limits of human endurance, reduced to shambling specters in a frozen wasteland. But it was the physical evidence, discovered over a century later, that revealed the true horror of the expedition's final days. In the 1980s and 1990s, multiple archaeological expeditions to King William Island made a grisly discovery. Human bones, scattered across the landscape, bore unmistakable signs of cut marks. The patterns on these bones were consistent with flesh removal using metal tools. In other words, these men were butchered after death. Some bones showed signs of being cracked open, likely to access the marrow inside. The conclusion was inescapable and horrifying. In their final desperate days, some members of Franklin's crew had resorted to cannibalism. Try to imagine the desperation that would drive men, products of Victorian society, to such extremes. But what drove these men to such a state? Modern analysis has provided some answers, and they're no less disturbing. Examination of recovered bones and hair samples revealed dangerously high levels of lead. The likely culprit? The expedition's own food supplies. The canned foods, which were relatively new technology at the time, were sealed with lead solder. As the cans were exposed to the Arctic cold, the lead leached into the food. It's a cruel irony that the very provisions meant to sustain them may have contributed to their demise. Lead poisoning would have caused physical weakness, mental deterioration, and possibly even madness among the crew. Symptoms include fatigue, confusion, and irritability, hardly ideal conditions for survival in one of the world's harshest environments. Compounding this was the onset of scurvy, a vitamin C deficiency that causes weakness, joint pain, and eventually death. The expedition's diet, lacking in fresh food, would have left them vulnerable to this sailor's scourge. Scurvy was the bane of long sea voyages. It causes old wounds to reopen, teeth to fall out, and eventually leads to a slow, painful death. The men of the Franklin expedition would have been watching their bodies literally fall apart. For over 150 years, the final resting places of HMS Erebus and HMS Terror remained a mystery. But in 2014 and 2016, both shipwrecks were finally discovered, adding new chapters to this Arctic saga. The ships were found in shallow waters off King William Island, remarkably well preserved in the cold Arctic waters. The level of preservation is astounding. The cold water has effectively refrigerated the wrecks, preserving artifacts that look like they were deposited yesterday, not 170 years ago. Items recovered from the wrecks paint a poignant picture of life aboard the doomed ships. A porcelain plate, a bottle of perfume, a pair of boots. Each item a tangible link to the men who perished in this frozen hell. These artifacts humanize the tragedy, reminding us that these weren't just names in a history book, but real people with hopes, dreams, and fears. The mystery of the Franklin expedition captured the Victorian imagination, spawning numerous seances and psychic investigations. In an age fascinated by spiritualism, many believed that the spirits of the dead crew might provide answers. While these supernatural inquiries yielded no concrete information, they speak to the profound impact the expedition's disappearance had on the public consciousness. The idea that 129 men could simply vanish into the Arctic vastness was too terrible to comprehend. The Franklin expedition pushed the boundaries of exploration, but at a terrible cost. It led to the mapping of much of the Arctic coastline, as search parties scoured the region for any sign of the lost ships. Ironically, the very act of searching for Franklin and his men led to the Northwest Passage finally being charted and navigated. The tragedy spurred a wave of Arctic exploration that filled in many of the blank spaces on the map. The graves of John Torrington, John Hartnell, and William Brain still stand on Beechey Island, lonely sentinels in the Arctic waste. They remind us of the 129 men who sailed into history and vanished into legend. The Franklin expedition remains one of history's great mysteries, a tale of ambition, endurance, and ultimately, tragedy. It serves as a chilling reminder of the Arctic's power and the thin line between triumph and disaster in the world's harshest environments.